She had nothing left. No money, no roof, no name worth speaking in this town. The man who destroyed her life was standing 10 feet away, smiling like he'd already won, because he had. Everyone in Iron Ridge had made sure of that. They took her husband, then her dignity, then her last reason to stay. But Silas Crow made one mistake. He left her alive, and he left her with one piece of paper. A deed to a mountain nobody wanted. That was his mistake. Because Evelyn Harper wasn't done. Not even close. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The wind came off the mountains early that October, bitter and sharp, carrying with it the first real promise of a brutal winter. It swept through the main street of Iron Ridge like something with a grudge, rattling storefront signs, lifting dust from the road in long brown spirals, and cutting through whatever thin layers of clothing a person might be wearing, as if those layers weren't there at all. Evelyn Harper felt every bit of it. She stood at the far end of the main street with her coat pulled tight and her boots starting to separate at the left sole, the leather peeling away from the toe in a way that let cold air in with every step she took. She'd wrapped a strip of cloth around the inside that morning, but it had already shifted loose. She could feel the grit of the road working its way through. She was 29 years old. She looked older. Her hair, which had once been the kind of deep auburn that made people turn their heads in church, was pinned back under a faded wool hat that had belonged to her husband. Most of her good things had either been sold off or taken from her over the past 11 months. The hat she kept. It still smelled faintly of Daniel, tobacco and sawdust, and something she couldn't name exactly but recognized as him. And on the mornings when it was hardest to get up off the floor of whatever barn or storage room she'd found shelter in, that smell was sometimes the only thing that got her moving. Iron Ridge was not a large town. It existed because of silver. Silver in the ground, silver in the mines, silver moving through the hands of men who'd built their entire lives around it. There were maybe 400 people in the valley, not counting the miners who rotated in and out of the camps up the hillside. There was a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, a sheriff's office that did what Silas Crow told it to do, and enough pride packed into those buildings to choke a horse. Evelyn had been inside almost every one of those buildings in the last 3 weeks. Every single one had turned her away. She stood now with a folded list in her coat pocket. Names she'd gathered from people who'd once been friendly with her and Daniel. People who'd sat at their table, eaten her cooking, laughed at Daniel's bad jokes. She'd gone through the list one by one, knocking on back doors when the front ones were shut, asking for work in the kitchen, in the storeroom, in the laundry, anything at all that would pay enough to get her through to spring. The list had 6 names on it. She'd crossed through all 6. The last one, a woman named Mabel Garrett, who ran the hotel laundry, had answered the door, looked Evelyn up and down, and then said in a low, almost apologetic voice, "I can't, Evelyn. I'm sorry. You know how it is." Evelyn did know how it was. Silas Crow had made it very clear to every business owner in Iron Ridge that employing Evelyn Harper was the same as spitting in his face. And nobody in this valley spat in Silas Crow's face. Not if they wanted to keep their contracts, their credit at the bank, their supply chains intact. She folded the list up smaller and pushed it deeper into her pocket. Then she started walking again, not because she had anywhere in particular to go, but because standing still made it worse. Made her feel like she was already finished, and she was not finished. She told herself that every morning, and she was going to keep telling herself that until she believed it completely or until she couldn't anymore. The street was busy for a Tuesday afternoon. A freight wagon pulled by 2 broad-chested mules was making its way toward the mining company offices. A pair of men she recognized as Crow's supervisors were coming out of the general store with brown paper packages under their arms, talking and not looking at her. 2 women on the boardwalk across the road saw her coming and found reasons to look in other directions. That was how it went. Nobody confronted her directly. They just looked away, like she was something shameful that had wandered into view and they were waiting politely for it to wander back out again. She passed the telegraph office. She passed the barber shop. She passed the small, mean-looking building with the painted wooden sign that read, Iron Ridge Mining Company, Silas Crow, Proprietor. The curtains in the front window shifted slightly as she walked by. She didn't slow down. At the end of the block, she stopped and looked at the land office, which was the last place on her list. a place she'd been avoiding because she wasn't sure what she was actually hoping to accomplish there. She had a deed. Technically, she had property, a parcel of rocky, uncleared land up on the northern face of the mountain, about 11 miles from town. Daniel had purchased it 3 years ago with money he'd saved over 5 years of mine work, a fact that Crow had later twisted into a story about stolen funds. It was a hard-worked purchase, paid for in small amounts over a long time, documented in a ledger that had gone missing around the same time Daniel died. Everyone in town said the land was worthless. Too rocky for farming, too steep for easy timber, too far from the road to be useful for anything except keeping goats, and only barely that. But it was hers, and on some mornings, staring at that deed in the gray light before dawn, Evelyn thought there was something about it that didn't add up. Something about the way Crow had moved against her so fast after Daniel died, before she'd even buried him properly. Something about the specific, deliberate force of it. You didn't work that hard to ruin someone over worthless land. She was still turning that thought over in her mind when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. Mrs. Harper. The voice was smooth, unhurried, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. She turned. Silas Crow was a tall man, well-fed and carefully dressed, with gray-streaked hair he kept neat under a dark hat. He wore a long coat that probably cost more than Evelyn had made in the last 2 years combined. His face was what people described as distinguished. Strong jaw, steady eyes, the kind of composed expression that suggested he hadn't been truly surprised by anything in a long time. He was flanked by 2 men. On his left was a large, flat-faced enforcer named Russ Holt, who'd worked for Crow for years and had the kind of eyes that stayed perfectly blank no matter what he was doing. On his right was a younger man, Brett Donnelly, who was new to Crow's operation, but had already made himself known around town as someone quick to anger and slow to think. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She didn't step back. "Mr. Crow," she said. "You look cold," he said, tilting his head in what was almost a sympathetic expression. "Hungry too, I'd imagine. Things haven't been going well for you, from what I hear." "Things are fine," she said. That made him smile. "Come now. There's no need for pride between us, is there? You've been going door to door for weeks. Nobody will hire you. You've been sleeping in the Carmichael barn for the past 12 nights. Yes, I know about that. And you've got about $2 left to your name." He paused to let the precision of that land on her. $2 and 1 piece of paper, he added, "which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you." "I didn't know you were looking to speak with me." "I'm always looking to speak with reasonable people." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I have a purchase offer here for your mountain parcel. $200. That's more than fair for land that isn't producing anything and won't ever produce anything. More than fair, in fact. You could leave Iron Ridge, go somewhere warmer, start over somewhere people don't know your name." The wind pushed between them, picking up a loose page from somewhere and sending it skittering across the road. Evelyn looked at the document, then she looked at Crow. $200, she said. $200. She thought about the winters she and Daniel had talked about surviving on that land, the way he'd spread the deed out on their kitchen table one evening and traced the property lines with his finger, telling her about what he thought was up there, what he thought the mountain might be worth if a person looked at it the right way. She'd told him he was dreaming. He'd smiled and said maybe. She missed that smile more than she had words for. "No," she said. Crow's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Excuse me?" "I said no, I'm not selling." A long pause. Down the street, a horse shook its head against its tie rail. Somewhere inside the general store, something heavy was set down on a counter. "Evelyn," Crow said, and for the first time his voice was different, not threatening exactly, but stripped of the warmth. "You don't have a future here, you know that. This town is done with you. If you stay through winter, you'll be in worse shape by spring than you are now. This offer is me being generous. I think carefully about that." "You had my husband killed," she said. The words came out of her quiet and flat, like she was stating the time of day. She'd said them before, to the sheriff, to anyone who would listen. Nobody ever acted on them, but she couldn't stop saying them. It felt like the only true thing she had left that nobody could take from her. Crow's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then he was smooth again. "Daniel Harper died in a mine accident," he said. "That's been ruled on. And before he died, there was evidence that he'd been skimming company funds for years. That's documented. Whatever grief you're carrying, Mrs. Harper, I'd encourage you not to let it curdle into paranoia. I'd encourage you, she said, to take your $200 and go back inside. She turned to walk away. That was when Russ Holt moved. He stepped forward and put one thick hand on her shoulder, not hard, but with a grip that said stop. She went rigid. Her hands closed into fists at her sides. The man's trying to help you, Holt said. He said it the way a person says something they don't believe but have been told to say. Let go of me, Evelyn said. Mrs. Harper. I said let go of me. Holt's grip tightened, just slightly. Brett Donnelly shifted his weight and smirked at something he seemed to find funny. You should listen to... That's enough. The voice came from across the street. Low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to fill space. All of them turned. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk opposite was large, not in the exaggerated, cartoonish way of someone trying to look dangerous, but in the simple, factual way of someone who had spent years doing physical work at high altitude. He was maybe 6'3", with wide shoulders and hands that looked like they'd been shaped for gripping things. His coat was worn and practical, not fashionable. His hat was dark. His beard was the kind that had been left to grow for functional rather than decorative reasons. He was looking at Holt with an expression that was entirely calm. He said, let go of her, the man repeated. Holt turned fully, his chin coming up. Who are you? Nobody in particular, but I'm watching you hold a woman's arm against her will in the middle of the street, and that's about all the reason I need. This is private business, Donnelly said, coming forward a half step. Mind yourself. The man on the opposite boardwalk didn't move. He just waited, the way a rock waits in the middle of a river, not threatening anything, not moving for anything. Crow made a small, precise gesture with 2 fingers. Holt released Evelyn's shoulder. He did it the way a man does something he doesn't want to do but has been reminded to, for now. This isn't your business, Blackwood, Crow said. No, the man said. It's not. A pause. But I'm making it mine. There was a long silence in which nobody moved, and the wind pushed through the street and the mules down the road shifted against their harnesses. Then Crow reached over, took his purchase offer from Donnelly, folded it, and put it back in his coat pocket. Another time, Mrs. Harper, he said, when you've had more time to think. He turned and walked back toward the mining company building, Holt and Donnelly falling in behind him without looking back. The door shut. The street went back to its ordinary noise and motion, as though nothing had happened at all. Evelyn stood on the boardwalk. She was shaking slightly, and she was angry at herself for shaking. The man, Blackwood, crossed the street toward her. Up close he was even larger than he'd looked from across the road, but his face, when she got a proper look at it, was less intimidating than the rest of him suggested. He wasn't handsome exactly. He had a crooked nose that had been broken at least once, deep-set eyes the color of Winter Creek water, and the kind of permanent squint that came from years of looking into mountain sun and wind. There was a scar running along his left jaw, old enough to be pale. You're Evelyn Harper, he said. Yes? Gideon Blackwood. He didn't extend his hand, just gave his name as information. I run a timber operation up the mountain, north face. She looked at him. I know who you are. She'd heard the name around town. People said different things about him, that he was antisocial, strange, that he'd had some kind of falling out with Crow years ago and moved himself permanently up into the high country to avoid any further interaction with the man or anything connected to him. She didn't know what was true and what was people filling in gaps. How long have you been in this situation? He asked. Which situation are you referring to? The one where you've got no work, nowhere to sleep, and a man like Crow trying to take the last thing you own. She looked away down the street. Long enough. He was quiet for a moment. When she glanced back at him, he was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not pity, exactly. Not sympathy in the performative way people sometimes displayed it. Something more direct than that. Do you want to survive, he said, or do you want to prove them wrong? She stared at him. What? Because those are 2 different things. Surviving means taking his money and leaving. Starting over somewhere quiet. Might be the smart choice. I'm not saying it isn't. He paused. But if you want to prove them wrong, that's harder. That takes longer, and it's going to cost you things you might not want to pay. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, a door somewhere opened and shut. The wind pushed again. "What's your stake in this?" she asked. "Crow's been trying to push me off my operation for 4 years," he said. "We're not friends. That's about all I'll say for now." "And you think I have something you need?" He almost smiled. "I think you have something he wants, which means it might be worth something real." She said nothing. "I've got work," he said, "if you want it. Bookkeeping, contracts, letters. I've got nobody who can do that kind of work properly, and it costs me every season, room and board included. It's not comfortable up there, but it's not the Carmichael barn either." Something moved in her chest. She couldn't tell if it was hope or the memory of what hope felt like, which were sometimes the same thing and sometimes completely different things. "You know what people in this town say about me," she said. "I know what people in this town say about me too," he replied. "I stopped listening a while back." She was quiet another moment. She looked at the mining company office down the street. She thought about Crow's face when she'd said no, about the precise, calculating way he'd produced that offer, the amount too specific, the timing too convenient, about Daniel spreading that deed out on the kitchen table and tracing property lines with his finger. "Maybe," he'd said, with that smile. "All right," she said. "I'll think about it tonight." "Fair enough," Gideon said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small card with a rough sketch of the mountain trail on it. "I'll be at the South Trailhead at 6 tomorrow morning. If you're there, you're there." He turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Evelyn stood on the empty boardwalk and held the card in both hands and felt the wind cutting through her worn coat and the cold working its way in through the split sole of her left boot. And for the first time in 11 months, she felt something that wasn't grief or fear or the specific exhausted numbness that had settled over everything else. She felt like a person who had a decision to make. She was at the South Trailhead at 5:45 the next morning. Gideon was already there, loading the last of a supply pack onto a gray mule with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this same task 600 times and expected to do it 600 more. He looked up when she came around the tree line. He didn't say anything that suggested he was surprised or pleased. He just went back to the pack. "There's coffee in the pot on the fire," he said. "We leave in 15. The coffee was strong and almost bitter, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks. They didn't talk much on the way up. The trail was steep and narrow and covered in last night's frost, requiring most of a person's attention just to stay upright. Evelyn's boots continued their slow betrayal, but she kept moving. Gideon set a pace that was fast but not punishing, and he never turned around to see if she was keeping up, which she found she appreciated more than she could explain. She didn't want to be looked after. She wanted to be treated as someone capable of keeping up. She kept up. The mountain rose around them as they climbed, pine and spruce first, then the older stands of timber, some of them big around as a wagon wheel, the forest floor thick with moss and needles, and the particular kind of quiet that exists only at high altitude. The sounds of Iron Ridge fell away below them until there was nothing but wind in the treetops and the mules' hooves on frozen ground and their own breathing in the cold air. After 2 hours, they cleared a long ridge and Evelyn stopped. The valley below was hidden behind the mountain now. What opened up in front of her instead was something she hadn't expected. A broad cleared bench on the mountainside, south-facing and protected on 3 sides by high ridge lines. There were structures, a main house, low and solid-looking, built from the same timber that surrounded it, a workshop, a stable large enough for 6 horses, and beyond those a proper mill operation, a long building with a water wheel turning in a creek that cut through the lower edge of the property, the sound of it carrying up the slope toward them even from this distance. There were men working. She counted 8, 9, 10 of them, spread across the yard and in and out of the mill building. They were hauling timber, running saws, loading a wagon with fresh-cut lumber. "You said timber operation," Evelyn said. "That's what it is," Gideon said. "This is more than I was imagining." He glanced at her. "What were you imagining?" She looked at the mill, the workers, the whole functioning operation carved out of the side of a mountain. "Something smaller. Most people think small about the things they can't see from town," he said, and started walking down toward the bench. She followed, still looking. But the room she was given was small, barely big enough for a cot, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. But it had a window that faced east and got the morning light, and it had a door with a latch, which meant it was private. After the Carmichael barn, it felt like something she'd once dreamed about. She sat on the edge of the cot that first night with the deed in her hands, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. She read it again in the candlelight, not because she didn't know what it said, but because reading it made her feel like it was real. Parcel 7, Survey Section 14, Northern Mountain Face. She'd memorized the words. She traced the boundaries with her finger just like Daniel had. She put the deed away in the bottom of her bag, beneath everything else, and told herself to sleep. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't slept well in nearly a year. But she was up before 6, and when she came into the main house, Gideon was already at the table with a stack of ledgers open in front of him and an expression on his face that suggested he'd been looking at them long enough to develop a specific grievance. "These are last year's supply contracts," he said, without looking up. "They're a mess." She sat across from him, pulled the closest ledger toward her, and looked at the columns. They were, in fact, a mess. "What system have you been using?" she asked. "Whatever system was convenient." "That's not a system." "No," he said. "It's not. Which is why I need someone who can turn it into one." She looked at the numbers. Despite everything, despite the cold and the sleeplessness and the year of steady degradation she'd been living through, she felt something sharpen in her mind the way it always had when there were numbers in front of her. Her father had kept the books for a small timber concern in Ohio when she was young, and he taught her everything he knew because she was the only one of his children who seemed to care about it. She'd kept Daniel's books after they married, and before everything went wrong, she'd been quietly managing the household accounts and the mine workers' payroll in a way that had kept 3 separate budgets straight without an error in 4 years. She could do this. She pulled a fresh page from the stack at the end of the table and started making notes. Gideon watched her for a moment. Then he stood and went out to the mill. He had his own work. Book. The week settled into a routine. Evelyn worked the books in the mornings and spent the afternoons learning the operation, the supply chains, the mill process, the timber contracts, the names and schedules of the men who worked the property. She was careful not to step into things that weren't her business, and careful not to make herself invisible either. She asked direct questions. She noted things that didn't make sense and asked about them. She made mistakes sometimes, calculations that didn't account for the freight premium at this altitude, estimates that were off because she hadn't yet understood the seasonal variables. And when she made mistakes, she corrected them and moved on without making a production of either the error or the correction. Gideon noticed. He didn't say so directly. He was not a man who said things directly unless he had to, but there were small signals. He started leaving more complicated problems for her to work through in the mornings. He started consulting her before he signed anything, rather than after. Once, after she'd caught a discrepancy in an outgoing invoice that would have cost him 3 weeks of profit, he looked at the correction for a long time without speaking. "Good catch," he finally said. Coming from Gideon Blackwood, she understood that this was something close to a speech. The men who worked the mill were wary of her at first. She was a woman from town, and they'd heard stories, but they were not unkind. Most of them had their own reasons for being up on the mountain instead of in the valley, their own complications, their own histories with Crow's operation or with the kinds of people Crow represented. They were rough, practical men who respected competence and didn't have much use for pretense. When they started to see that she could do the work, they stopped being wary and started being ordinary. One of them, an older man named Pete Jarvis, who ran the water wheel and seemed to know more about the mountain than anyone else on the property, brought her coffee some mornings without being asked. She didn't say anything about it. She just took the coffee. And slowly, without her fully noticing it happening, the constant tight fear that had been living in her chest for 11 months began, if not to disappear, then to settle. She still thought about Daniel every day. She still woke sometimes in the dark, heart hammering, reaching for something that wasn't there. She still caught herself doing the arithmetic of loss the way people do, counting up the things that were gone and trying to balance them against the things that remained. But she was working. She had a door that latched. She had coffee in the morning and problems to solve and a view out her east window of the mountain face going pink in the early light. She was not fixed, but she was not finished either. It was on a frozen Tuesday in the 3rd week of November when everything changed again. She was sorting through a wooden crate in the back room of the main house, the storage space where Gideon kept documents he didn't need regularly but hadn't gotten around to dealing with. looking for a timber survey from 1874 that she needed for a contract reference. The crate was full of the usual paper detritus of a working operation: old invoices, surveyor maps, letters from suppliers, a couple of outdated territorial government notices, and then at the bottom, beneath a folded map she nearly didn't move, a bundle of letters. 6 or 7 of them, tied with a piece of brown string. The handwriting on the outside of the top one was familiar in the way that something familiar can knock you sideways when you're not expecting it. She knew that handwriting. She'd been reading that handwriting for years on grocery lists, on the margins of the newspaper, on birthday notes. She'd found it on a letter he'd written her and never sent, after a bad argument, because he'd said the things he wanted to say on paper first to make sure he got them right. Daniel, she thought, before she even consciously processed it. Her hands were not entirely steady when she picked the bundle up. She sat down right there on the storage room floor, not bothering to find a chair, and undid the string. The letters were written in Daniel's hand. That much was immediately clear. The same careful, slightly cramped handwriting she'd memorized without trying to. The dates on them ran from January to June of the year he died. The first 2 were technical notes: observations, measurements, coordinates. She almost didn't understand them at first, and then she did. He'd been surveying, not for Crow, on his own time, in secret. He'd been surveying the northern mountain parcel. Their parcel. She kept reading. The 3rd letter was addressed to no one. It was a private working note, the kind of thing Daniel wrote when he was thinking out loud. He'd been doing that since she knew him, writing things out to clarify them for himself. The formation below the upper bench is consistent with what I've seen in the Comstock secondary veins. The depth estimate puts it at 60 feet, maybe 70, which is accessible with proper equipment. I don't want to say this out loud yet because I need to be sure, but I am becoming sure. She stopped reading. She looked at the wall. Then she looked back at the letter. There is silver here, a lot of it, not surface ore. A proper deposit. I believe it runs at least 800 feet laterally based on the surface indications and the creek mineral content. If I'm right about this, the letter ended mid-thought, like he'd been interrupted. She sat with it in her hands for a very long time. Then she read the next one, and the next. The picture they assembled was slow and terrible and completely clear. Daniel had spent 6 months quietly surveying the mountain parcel on his own time, using skills he'd developed over years of mine work and reading everything he could get his hands on about ore geology. He'd become more and more convinced that the parcel contained a significant silver deposit, not the marginal surface material that made people write land off as worthless, but a real vein at depth. A vein that, if it was what he thought it was, would be worth more than everything Silas Crow owned. He'd also, in the 6th letter, written something that made her close her eyes. Crow knows. I don't know how he found out, but he knows I've been surveying. Holt came to see me last week at the mine, and it wasn't about anything official. He was fishing. I told him nothing. But I think I need to be careful. I'm going to move the survey notes somewhere safe before I do anything else. I don't trust the house. That was the last letter, dated 3 weeks before the mine collapse. Evelyn sat on the storage room floor with the letters in her lap, and the cold coming in through the gaps in the old wall boards, and she understood everything. Not because the letters told her something entirely new. She'd always believed Crow had arranged Daniel's death. She'd believed it since the week after the funeral, when the accusations started coming too fast and too organized to be anything but prepared in advance. But this was different from believing. This was a reason, a specific, enormous, documented reason. Daniel hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't been skimming. He'd been sitting on top of a silver fortune that Crow desperately wanted. And when Crow found out, he'd had Daniel killed and then spent the following year destroying Evelyn's reputation to keep her too poor and too powerless to ever challenge him for the land. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. Then she stood up, carefully folded the letters, and put them inside her coat. She found Gideon out at the mill, supervising the final run of the day's timber through the blade. The sound of the saw made conversation impossible for a moment. She waited. When it finished, he turned and saw her face. "What's wrong?" he said. Not a question, exactly. "Nothing's wrong," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "But I need to talk to you." He sent the mill crew home early that evening. They sat at the table in the main house with the letters spread out between them and 2 cups of coffee going cold while she told him everything. Gideon didn't interrupt her. He didn't ask questions until she'd said all of it. He just listened, reading the letters she pointed to, his face unreadable. When she finished, the fire had burned down low and neither of them had touched the coffee. He was quiet for a long moment. How sure was he, Gideon finally said, about the deposit? He was an experienced miner. He'd been doing this for 15 years. She paused. He didn't overstate things. That wasn't his way. If he wrote it down like that, she gestured at the letters. He was sure. Another silence. Crow's been trying to buy that parcel for 3 years, Gideon said. I always figured it was just about the land position, blocking supply routes, that kind of thing. That's how he operates. He looked at the letters. I didn't know about this. Nobody did. That was the point. Gideon was quiet again. He looked at the fire. You've got the deed, he said. I've got the deed. And now you've got the letters. Yes. He looked at her. What do you want to do with that? She met his eyes. I don't want to run, she said. If that's what you're asking. He thought about that for a moment. No, he said slowly. It isn't what I was asking. She picked up one of the letters, the last one, the one dated 3 weeks before the collapse, and looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and held it. He left me something, she said. He didn't know what he was leaving me. He was just trying to keep himself safe. But he left me something real. She looked up. I want to use it. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Gideon Blackwood looked at her across the table with an expression that was still difficult to read. But there was something in it she hadn't seen before. Something that might have been the beginning of a plan. Then we'd better think carefully, he said. Because a man like Crow doesn't let go of something like this without a fight. I know that, Evelyn said, and it's going to be a bad winter. I know that too, she said. I've had a bad year. I can manage a winter. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up one of the letters and started reading it again, slowly, the way a man reads something he's going to need to remember exactly. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the cold coffee cup and stared at the fire and thought about Daniel at the kitchen table, tracing property lines on that deed with his finger, saying maybe with that quiet smile. Not maybe. She knew now. It had never been maybe. It had always been yes. The first snow came on a Thursday. Evelyn knew it was coming before she went to sleep the night before. She'd felt it in the particular heaviness of the air, the way the temperature dropped not gradually, but in one clean step, like the mountain had made a decision. By morning, 6 inches covered the yard, and more was falling, and the world outside her east window had turned itself into something that looked almost beautiful if you weren't responsible for getting work done in it. She was responsible for getting work done in it. She pulled on her second pair of socks. She'd found a pair of Gideon's wool socks in the communal supply chest and had appropriated them without asking, and he'd noticed and said nothing, which she took as permission, and went to make coffee before anyone else was up. She'd been on the mountain for 6 weeks. She was still learning the shape of things, not just the books and the contracts, which she was beginning to understand well enough to find the gaps in, but the physical operation itself, the way the mill ran differently in cold weather, requiring the water wheel to be managed more carefully against the risk of ice. The particular social arrangements of the men who worked the property, the unspoken hierarchies and old frictions that showed up sideways in the way they talked to each other. The mountain itself, which had moods she was starting to be able to read from her window in the morning. And Gideon. Understanding Gideon Blackwood was its own ongoing project. He was not a man who explained himself. He gave information when it was necessary and withheld it when he decided it wasn't, and the line between those two categories was not always obvious from the outside. He was fair. She'd seen nothing in 6 weeks that suggested otherwise. But fair in a specific, unsentimental way that didn't involve much softness. When one of the mill workers, a young man named Caleb, made an error that cost a day's production, Gideon didn't raise his voice. He laid out exactly what had gone wrong, exactly what it had cost, and exactly what needed to happen differently next time. Then he walked away. He didn't punish beyond the conversation, but Caleb didn't make that mistake again. Evelyn found she respected that. She'd spent enough of the previous year watching people perform anger for an audience that genuine, uncomplicated directness felt almost like a relief. But the conversation they'd had after she found Daniel's letters, that sat differently from everything else that had happened in those 6 weeks. She'd laid out the whole of it, the survey notes, the letter about Crow, the timeline. And Gideon had listened, and at the end he'd said, "We'd better think carefully." Not, "I'll help you," not, "Let me know what you need," just "we." She hadn't asked him what he meant by that. She'd let it sit. But she'd thought about it most of every night since. She was thinking about it now, standing at the stove with the coffee beginning to work through the grounds, when Gideon came in from the back. He was already fully dressed and had snow on his coat, which meant he'd been outside since before first light. "The creek's icing at the edges," he said, hanging the coat on the peg near the door. "We've got maybe 3-4 days before we need to shut down the wheel and switch to the handsaws." "I know, I adjusted the production projections last night." She poured him a cup without being asked. "Assuming 4 days of full production and then a partial shutdown, we can still make the December shipment if we front-load the cutting." He took the cup. "How front-loaded?" "It means the men work Saturday." He made a sound that wasn't quite disagreement. "They won't love that." "No, but if we miss the December shipment, we lose the railroad bonus, which is 12% of the quarter. I'd rather they be annoyed with us for one Saturday than annoyed with us for the whole spring when I have to tell them the bonus didn't come through." Gideon looked at her over the rim of his cup. He did that sometimes. Looked at her in a way that she couldn't fully interpret, that seemed to be calculating something she didn't have access to. Then he nodded. "Saturday it is," he said. "I'll tell Pete." She turned back to the stove. "There's something else." "Go on." "The Harmon brothers' contract. They've been paying on 45-day terms, but I've been looking at their payment history, and they're consistently at 52 days. That 7-day difference has been costing you a compounding cash flow problem every quarter for 2 years. I think we should renegotiate the terms to 30 days and compensate them with a marginal price reduction." He was quiet. She turned to look at him. "You've been going back 2 years," he said. "I had to understand the pattern before I could recommend anything." He set his cup down on the table and pulled out the chair and sat in it with the particular kind of weight that meant he was thinking seriously. "What kind of price reduction?" he said. 2%. It would hurt in the short term, but it pays for itself inside 6 months, and after that it's straight margin improvement." He looked at the table for a moment. "Do it," he said. She nodded and went back to the stove, and they were quiet for a while in the way they'd gotten comfortable being quiet, which was something she hadn't expected to find with another person this soon, this naturally. She and Daniel had been good at silence too, but it had taken years. This had taken weeks, and she wasn't entirely sure what to make of that. "About the letters," Gideon said without preamble. She went still. "I've been thinking about how we approach this," he said. "We can't go to the sheriff. You already know that. Crow owns the sheriff. He owns most of what's in that valley." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "But there are people he doesn't own. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, the Federal Mineral Rights Authorities, and—" He paused. "The railroad." She turned fully to face him. "What about the railroad?" "The Western Pacific has been trying to extend a spur line into this mountain range for 3 years. Crow's been blocking them. He doesn't want the competition, doesn't want outside money coming in, doesn't want anything he can't control. If we went to the railroad with a timber contract that undercuts Crow's pricing and made them understand that the mountain access issues they've been fighting were manufactured, they'd have a reason to investigate him," Evelyn said slowly. "More than that, they'd have a reason to invest in pushing him out." He looked up at her. "Rich men with power stop other rich men with power. The law doesn't do it. Regular people don't do it. But if we could put the Western Pacific in direct competition with Crow, with the understanding of what's on that mountain—" "You're talking about using the silver deposit." "I'm talking about what the silver deposit represents. We don't announce it. We don't wave it around. But if the right people in the right places understand that there are significant mineral rights in play on land that Crow has been trying to acquire through fraud—" He left the rest hanging. Evelyn thought about it. She could feel the shape of the thing he was describing, the way it would need to be built, slowly and carefully, each piece placed without letting the overall structure show until it was strong enough to stand on its own. "That's a long game," she said. "Yes. Months. Probably. And in the meantime, Crow knows I'm up here. He knows I didn't take his money. He's going to keep applying pressure." "He is," Gideon agreed. But the mountain is harder to pressure than a boardwalk in Iron Ridge. He'd have to send men up here, and that's a different calculation than leaning on local businesses. He'll try other things first. What other things? Gideon's jaw shifted slightly. He'll try to starve us out, block supply routes, get to our contractors, make it difficult for us to operate. He's already been doing that to you, to a degree, but now he's going to have a real reason. He looked at her. You said no to him in the middle of the street. He's not going to forget that. She was quiet. Are you still willing to do this? He said. The fire had built itself up by then, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the snow was still coming down past her east window. She thought about the Carmichael barn. She thought about Daniel's letter, the handwriting she'd know anywhere. I think I need to be careful. She thought about Crow's face, the 1 second of jaw tightening before the smooth composure settled back over it, when she'd said you had my husband killed. I'm willing, she said. The plan, such as it was in those early weeks, was built from the inside out. Evelyn worked the books during the day and worked the strategy in the evenings, spreading papers across the kitchen table after the mill crew had gone to the bunkhouse. She drafted letters to suppliers that offered better terms in exchange for exclusivity, quietly pulling business away from Crow-connected vendors without making an obvious move of it. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office requesting confirmation of the deed's registration and quietly initiating the formal documentation process that would make any legal challenge to her ownership significantly more difficult. She also started a separate journal. Not for the business, for Daniel. She wrote down everything she remembered him saying about the mountain parcel, every observation, every guess, every conversation at the kitchen table when he'd been working out his theories. She cross-referenced these memories against his survey letters. She wasn't a geologist, and she knew it, but she understood enough from years of living with a miner to recognize the pattern of what he'd found. She drew her own crude maps based on his coordinates. She annotated the letters. She was building a case. She didn't know yet exactly for whom, but she was building it. Gideon, for his part, began quietly strengthening relationships with the timber buyers and freight operators who'd been on the fence about Crow's dominance of the valley market. He drove down to Iron Ridge twice in November and once in early December, not to confront anyone, but to have conversations. In saloons, in the backs of wagons, on street corners in the cold, with men who moved goods and money and who had their own grievances against the way Crow ran things. He came back from those trips quieter than usual, which was saying something. Evelyn learned not to ask immediately. She'd let him sit with it for an evening, and by morning he'd be ready to talk about what he'd found. Crow's mine production is down, he said one morning in December, spreading his coffee cup on the table like he was setting down something heavy. More than anyone in town is saying publicly. He's been cutting crews. The investors he brought in from Denver 2 years ago are starting to ask questions. How bad? Bad enough that $200 for a mountain parcel was probably a stretch for him. He looked at her. He needs that land, Evelyn. He needs it badly. His existing operation is failing, and he knows the silver on your parcel is the only thing that fixes it. She absorbed that, so he's more desperate than he looked. He's very good at not looking desperate. That's probably his best skill. Gideon leaned back in his chair. But desperate men make mistakes, or they get dangerous. Both, he said, usually in that order. The weeks between that conversation and Christmas were the strangest kind of hard. The kind that comes from waiting, from knowing something is building and not being able to see its full shape yet. The mill ran, the contracts moved. The letters went out and came back. Evelyn got better at reading the mountain's moods from her east window. She learned which sounds meant the water wheel was struggling and which meant it was fine. She learned that Pete Jarvis knew more about this particular stretch of mountain than anyone alive, and that if you wanted that knowledge, you had to drink bad coffee with him in the wheelhouse for an hour before he started talking. She did that more than once. She also had an argument with Gideon. It was about the Western Pacific letter, the formal approach she'd been drafting for 3 weeks, the one that would initiate the real strategic part of what they were doing. Evelyn thought the letter should be direct about the mineral rights situation. Gideon thought it was too soon, that they needed more documentation before they put anything that specific in writing to a railroad. They disagreed about this at some volume, which surprised both of them because they'd been so consistently calm with each other that actual conflict felt strange and sharp. If we wait until the documentation is perfect, Crow moves first, Evelyn said, laying both hands flat on the table in a way that meant she was holding her position. He's not going to wait for us to be ready. If we send that letter now, and the railroad asks for documentation we can't produce yet, we lose the relationship before it starts, Gideon said. We need them to trust us. We need them to be interested first. Trust comes after. Not with railroads. Railroads don't do anything without numbers. Then I'll give them numbers. She picked up the draft. I've built projections based on Daniel's survey estimates and the current silver market price. I'm not claiming certainty. I'm making a case for investigation. That's not the same thing. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him working through it. Let me read it again, he finally said. She handed it to him. He read it at the table while she stood by the window and deliberately did not watch him read it. He put it down. Change the second paragraph, he said. The language about the deposit is too definitive. Soften it. Make it provisional, like you said. We're not selling them certainty. We're selling them a reason to look. She sat down and picked up the pen. Agreed. He watched her rewrite it. You're not wrong, he said, about moving first. I know, she said. Neither are you. They sent the letter the following morning. January brought weather that made October look mild. The temperature dropped hard in the first week of the new year and stayed there. A cold that wasn't just uncomfortable but genuinely punishing, the kind that turned work into a question of endurance. The mill ran on reduced hours. The men worked in shorter shifts, rotating inside more frequently to keep from losing fingers. Evelyn kept the main house stove burning through the night, checking it once at midnight and once at 4, which meant she was sleeping in chunks that left her permanently half-tired, but not so tired she couldn't function. She was sitting at the kitchen table at midnight in the second week of January, doing the quarterly accounts by lamplight because her brain wouldn't let her sleep until she'd finished, when she heard boots on the porch. Not Gideon. She knew his steps. She got up quietly and went to the window and looked out. One of the mill workers, young Caleb, was standing on the porch, and he had his hat in his hands in a way that meant something was wrong. She opened the door. What happened? She'd said. 2 men came up the South Trail about an hour ago, he said. His face was red from the cold, and his voice was trying not to shake. They didn't say who they were. They spoke to Marcus. Marcus was the night watch. Then they left, but Marcus said one of them had a paper and the other one was just... He stopped. Just what? Just there to be intimidating, Marcus said. What was on the paper? Caleb swallowed. A letter from the Granger Freight Company. They're canceling their contract. Effective immediately. He looked at his boots. They were Crow's men. Marcus recognized one of them. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. She stood in the doorway with the cold air coming in past her and thought about Gideon's words. Desperate men make mistakes, or they get dangerous. Both, usually, in that order. Thank you, Caleb, she said. Go get some sleep. Should I wake Mr. Blackwood? I'll handle it. She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, her hand flat on the table. Granger Freight was significant. They handled about 30% of the outbound timber volume. Losing them hurt. It didn't cripple them because she'd been quietly building relationships with 2 alternate operators since November specifically because she'd anticipated something like this. But it hurt. More importantly, it was a message. She picked up the lamp and went to Gideon's door and knocked twice, short and even. A pause. Then, yeah. Crow moved, she said through the door. Granger Freight. We need to talk in the morning. A shorter pause. All right. She went back to the accounts. She didn't finish them that night. Her concentration had broken. But she sat at the table with them open in front of her until she was steady again, the lamp burning low and the fire ticking in the stove and the cold pressing against the windows. In the morning, she told Gideon what had happened. He listened without expression. Then he went outside for 20 minutes by himself. She could see him from the window, standing at the edge of the yard in the early light, looking down the mountain toward the invisible valley. When he came back in, his face was set. Who are the alternates? He said. Morrison's out of Laramie and the Kendall operation. I've been in contact with both since November. Something shifted in his expression. November. I thought we should have options. He sat down at the table. You've been planning for this since November. I've been planning for things like this since I understood what we were doing, she said. That's my job. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire settled. Outside, Pete was already at the wheelhouse, getting the equipment ready for another short shift day. "Write to Morrison today," Gideon said. "And Kendall, don't tell them why we need to switch. Just confirm we want to activate." "I already drafted both letters last week," she said, and pushed them across the table. He looked at the letters. Then he looked at her. "Evelyn," he said, and then stopped. "What?" He shook his head slowly, but the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not impressed exactly. Something warmer than impressed and less comfortable with itself. "Nothing," he said, and picked up the letters. "I'll add my signature." She turned back to the accounts, and if she was managing a small private feeling about the way he'd said her name just then, she kept that information entirely to herself. February was when the response came from the Western Pacific. She recognized the envelope, the railroad's mark in the corner, the Cheyenne postmark, before she'd finished pulling it out of the mailbag that the supply rider brought up once a week. She sat down on the porch steps in the cold and opened it. It was 2 pages. The first was formal, the kind of careful corporate language that committed to nothing while indicating interest in everything. The second was different, shorter, written in a different hand, and it said, "The matters you've described are of significant concern to us. We have assigned our territorial land attorney, Mr. Charles Fenn, to review your documentation. He will be in the Laramie office from March 15th through March 30th. We would encourage a meeting at your convenience during that period." She read it twice. Then she stood up and went inside to find Gideon. He was in the workshop working on a saw blade that had been giving them trouble all week. He looked up when she came in. She held out the letter without saying anything. He took it and read it. She watched his face while he read. He looked up. "March 15th, he said. "Yes." "That's 6 weeks." "Yes." He looked at the letter again. Then he set it down on the workbench beside the disassembled saw blade and looked out the workshop's single window at the snow-covered yard. "We need more documentation," he said. "I know. I've been thinking about that." She leaned against the doorframe. "Daniel's letters aren't enough on their own. We need independent geological corroboration, or at least a credible argument for why the deposit is where he said it was. Something a territorial attorney can take seriously." "There's a mining surveyor in Laramie," Gideon said slowly. "Name of Asa Webb. He's retired now, mostly, but he's the best geological surveyor I've ever met, and he's got no connection to Crow." He paused. "He owes me a favor." Evelyn looked at him. "A real one," Gideon said. "Not a polite one." "How real?" He almost smiled. It was the rare, slightly crooked version. "Real enough that he'll come up a mountain in winter if I ask him to." She thought about the timeline. 6 weeks, the letters, the survey coordinates Daniel had left. "Ask him," she said. Gideon nodded slowly, still looking out the window. She should have left it there. Should have gone back inside and started preparing the documentation for the meeting, but she stood in the doorway a moment longer. "Why do you do this?" she said. He turned to look at her. "What?" "This." She gestured vaguely at the mountain, the operation, the whole complicated thing they'd built themselves into. "You could have left when Crow first started pushing you. You could have taken your mill somewhere easier. Why stay?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My father built the first structure on this mountain," he said. "Not this one. A trapper's cabin, 20 years ago, before there was anything up here at all. He didn't have anything either. He just found a place that was hard enough to get to that nobody else had claimed it." He paused. "He died before he got to see what it became. But he started it." Evelyn was quiet. "I'm not leaving," Gideon said. It was simple. Not dramatic, not defiant. Just a fact about himself that he'd made peace with a long time ago. She nodded. "Then neither am I," she said, and went back inside to write the letters. Asa Webb arrived on the first Thursday in March, riding a bad-tempered bay horse and carrying a kit of surveying equipment that looked like it had been to the ends of the earth and back. He was 60-something, small and wiry, with the kind of weathered competence that made you want to get out of his way and let him work. He shook Evelyn's hand when they were introduced and looked at her with sharp gray eyes. "You're the one with the letters?" he said. "I am." "Let me see them." She spread them on the table. He read them standing up, not sitting, which she found she liked. He asked 3 precise questions about Daniel's methodology. She answered 2 of them with confidence, and the third she said she didn't know. Good, Webb said, surprisingly. I don't trust people who claim to know things they can't know. He spent 2 days on the mountain parcel, moving through snow and frozen ground with the focused patience of a man who'd been reading the earth his whole life. He didn't tell them what he was finding as he went. He just worked. On the evening of the second day, he came in, stamped the snow off his boots, sat at the kitchen table, and put his field notes down. Your husband was right, he said. He was looking at Evelyn when he said it. She kept her face neutral. Her hands, under the table, were not entirely neutral. The formation below the upper bench is consistent with a significant secondary vein system, Webb continued. I can't give you the depth without a test bore, but the surface indicators your husband documented are accurate. Conservative estimate on the deposit value based on current market pricing and accessible yield. He looked at his notes. $4 million, possibly significantly more. The room was very quiet. Gideon let out a slow breath. Evelyn sat completely still. $4 million beneath a piece of land everyone in Iron Ridge had called worthless. Beneath the land Daniel had bought in small payments over 5 years, saving every month, believing in something he couldn't fully prove yet. Can you put that in a formal report? She said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. That's why Gideon brought me up a mountain in winter, Webb said, with the specific dry humor of a man who found most things faintly ridiculous but worked through them anyway. I'll have it written by end of week. After Webb had gone to the room they'd prepared for him, Evelyn and Gideon sat at the table without speaking for a while. The fire worked. The wind moved outside. Somewhere down at the bunkhouse, one of the mill workers was playing a harmonica badly. $4 million, Gideon said. He said possibly more. A long silence. What are you thinking? He said. She looked at the table. She was thinking about Daniel, about what that number would have meant to him. A man who'd spent 15 years swinging a pick underground for other people's profit, who'd believed hard enough in something he couldn't fully see to save for it month by month until he had enough to buy it. She was thinking that he'd been right. He'd been right about all of it, and it had gotten him killed, and the least she could do, the absolute minimum she owed him, was make sure it meant something. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that we have a meeting to prepare for. She picked up her pen. The road to Laramie took 2 days in March conditions, 1 day down the mountain and across the valley floor. Another across open country where the wind came at you sideways with nothing to stop it. Gideon drove the wagon. Evelyn sat beside him with the document case across her knees, the clasp checked 3 times before they'd left the property. Inside the case, Asa Webb's formal geological report, 14 pages of precise professional language that added up to one enormous fact. Daniel's letters, copied in Evelyn's hand with the originals wrapped separately in oilcloth. The deed, properly notarized now through the Territorial Land Office, which had required a separate trip to Cheyenne in February that Evelyn had made alone because Gideon couldn't leave the mill during the short shift period, and she'd decided waiting was worse than going. And a 40-page summary document she'd written herself over 6 weeks of evenings, laying out the timeline of events, Daniel's discovery, his death, Crow's campaign against her, with every piece of supporting evidence she had cross-referenced and indexed in the back. She'd written it the way her father had taught her to keep books, every claim supported, every number sourced, no empty assertions. They didn't talk much on the road. The cold required most of a person's concentration just to tolerate, and the terrain demanded attention. But somewhere in the long, flat stretch before Laramie, with the mountains behind them and the wind pushing hard across the open ground, Gideon said, without looking at her, "You're not nervous." She considered that. "I am nervous." "You don't look it." "I learned a long time ago that looking nervous doesn't help anything." She pulled her coat tighter. "My father used to say the numbers either hold up or they don't. If they hold up, you have nothing to be nervous about. If they don't, being nervous won't fix them." "Do they hold up?" "Yes," she said. "They hold up." He nodded once and went back to watching the road. The Laramie office of the Western Pacific Railroad occupied the second floor of a brick building near the freight depot. Carpeted floors, a polished conference table, the particular smell of warm indoor air and paper that Evelyn associated with serious money being discussed in calm voices. Charles Fenn, the territorial land attorney, was a compact man in his mid-40s with a careful way of speaking that suggested he'd trained himself out of whatever natural bluntness he'd started with. He shook Evelyn's hand without hesitation, which she noted. He shook Gideon's hand and said he'd heard of the Blackwood operation and that the railroad had been hoping for a reason to work with them. They sat down. Evelyn opened the case. She'd decided on the drive down that she would do most of the talking. Not because Gideon couldn't. He was capable, and he knew the operation better than anyone. But because the documents were hers, the story was hers, and she'd found over the past months that there was something that happened when she stood behind her own work. Something that didn't happen any other way. She laid out the geological report first. Let Fenn read it without interruption. He read slowly. When he finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment. "This is Asa Webb's work," he said. "Yes." "He's credible, very credible." He looked up. "This deposit, if it bears out?" "It will bear out," Evelyn said. "But that's not the first thing I need you to understand." Fenn waited. She put Daniel's letters in front of him, then the timeline document, then the deed. "The land is mine," she said, "legally and properly. It was purchased by my husband and passed to me. What I need you to understand is that the man currently operating the primary mine concern in Iron Ridge has known about this deposit for at least 2 years, that he arranged the death of my husband to prevent the discovery from becoming public, and that he has spent the 14 months since then systematically destroying my ability to challenge him legally or financially." She paused. "He failed. And now I'm here." Fenn looked at the letters. He looked at the timeline. He looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "these are serious accusations." "Yes, they are." "Do you have evidence beyond the letters?" "The geological report establishes the deposit, not the criminal conduct." "I have the pattern of conduct," she said. "I have the timeline. I have the letters, which establish that my husband knew Crow was aware of the survey, and I have the fact that my husband died in a mine accident 3 weeks after writing the last one." She held Fenn's gaze. "I also have a separate set of documents, freight records, contract terminations, supply chain interference, that establish an ongoing pattern of commercial intimidation directed against me personally since his death. The criminal investigation is a matter for federal authorities. What I'm here to discuss with you is whether the Western Pacific Railroad has an interest in a situation where a significant silver deposit and a viable timber operation are currently being suppressed by a man who's been blocking your expansion into this mountain range for 3 years. A long silence. Fenn looked at Gideon, who had been sitting quietly the whole time. "Is that your assessment as well, Mr. Blackwood?" "That's an accurate summary," Gideon said. Fenn looked back at the documents. He picked up the geological report again and read a specific section. Then he set it down. "I'm going to need to show these to our principal investors," he said. "And I'm going to want our own geological assessment before we commit to anything." "That's reasonable," Evelyn said. "We'd expect nothing less. In the meantime," he looked at the deed, "I want to make sure we understand the ownership structure clearly. This is currently held solely in your name?" "Yes." "And there are no competing claims that Crow has filed?" "He hasn't filed anything because he's been operating on the assumption that he can acquire the land through pressure rather than through courts. Filing a competing claim would require him to explain publicly why he wants it, which he can't do without exposing the fraud." She paused. "That's his problem. He can't move legally without admitting things he needs to keep quiet. And he can't keep applying personal pressure now that I'm no longer in the valley alone." Fenn nodded slowly. "You've thought this through carefully." "I've had time," she said. They spent another 2 hours with Fenn going through the documents line by line. He asked good questions, precise, professional questions that required precise answers, and Evelyn had precise answers for all of them. Twice Gideon added information about the commercial operations that Evelyn didn't have in her notes, and she let him take those questions without interrupting. They were working well together by then, in the particular way that happens when 2 people have been solving problems side by side for long enough that they know instinctively which parts belong to whom. When they left the building, the sun was already low, and the cold was coming back sharp. Gideon walked beside her toward the wagon without saying anything for a block. "Well," he finally said. "He's going to move," Evelyn said. Not immediately. He'll want the independent survey, and he'll want his investors on board. But he's going to move. How long? 6 weeks. Maybe 8. She climbed up to the wagon seat, which means Crow has 6 to 8 weeks to do something drastic before he loses whatever leverage he thinks he still has. Gideon got up on his side. He looked straight ahead down the Laramie Street for a moment. Then we need to be ready for drastic, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. We do. Spring came to the mountain the way it always does at altitude, badly, in fits, the warmth arriving and then retreating, the snow pulling back from the southern slopes while the north-facing hollows held ice through April. The mill was running at full capacity again, the water wheel turning strong in the snow-melt-swollen creek, and the yard was loud from first light with the sound of work. Evelyn ran the operation from the kitchen table and from the supply shed and from the edge of the mill floor, wherever she needed to be. She was not the same woman who'd climbed this mountain in October with a split boot sole and $2 to her name. She wasn't sure exactly when the change had happened. It wasn't a single moment, but a slow accumulation of mornings where she'd gotten up and done the work and gone to sleep and gotten up again, until the confidence that she could handle whatever came next was not a thing she was telling herself, but a thing she simply knew. She was also, by late March, deeply aware of something she'd been trying not to think about directly. She and Gideon had been living in close proximity for 5 months. They'd eaten at the same table every morning. They'd argued about contracts and freight routes and the best way to handle a worker dispute. He'd come and found her when something needed her attention, and she'd done the same. They'd sat across from each other through long evenings of paperwork and through longer evenings where neither of them was working, just present, reading or thinking, in a quiet that had become something she'd started to depend on without meaning to. She noticed things about him that she hadn't noticed at first, the way he moved very carefully around things that mattered to him. Not delicately, but precisely, like he'd learned at some point that carelessness cost more than it saved. The way he listened when she talked, which was genuinely and completely without preparing his response while she was still speaking. The way he'd once, in February, when she'd come to the kitchen at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, and sat at the table staring at nothing, put a cup of coffee in front of her without saying a word, and then sat down across from her and just been there. She hadn't asked for that. He hadn't offered it. It had just happened, and it had helped more than she could account for. She was not ready for any of it. She knew that too. The grief for Daniel was still there, not as sharp as it had been, but still present, woven into everything in a way that didn't leave room for simple feelings. She didn't know what Gideon felt. He was not a man who made that kind of thing easy to read. She left it alone. There was enough to manage without adding that. What she couldn't leave alone was the growing sense that Crow was about to move. It started with small things. One of their mill workers, a man named Sutter, who'd been with Gideon for 2 years, gave his notice without explanation and was gone before the end of the week. 3 days later, the Morrison freight operator sent a cautious letter saying he'd received an approach from an unnamed party offering to pay him double to cancel his contract with the Blackwood operation. Morrison had turned it down, but he'd written to warn them, which meant the approach had happened, which meant Crow was working his way through their supply chain, looking for the weak point. "He's running out of time," Evelyn said, pinning the Morrison letter to the wall with the others. She'd started keeping a physical record of every move Crow made, a kind of map of his actions that she could look at and read the pattern in. "The Western Pacific is going to respond to us within the next few weeks. He must know something is happening even if he doesn't know what exactly. He's trying to destabilize us before we have the railroad behind us." "Sutter," Gideon said. "What about him?" "He was the only man here who had regular contact in town. He went to Iron Ridge twice a month for personal reasons." Gideon's jaw was tight. He might have been reporting back. Evelyn thought about that. "For how long?" "I don't know. Long enough for Crow to know our freight arrangements." He looked at the Morrison letter. Long enough to know who to approach. She sat with that for a moment. The idea that someone had been watching from inside, it was unpleasant in the specific way that betrayal is always unpleasant, even when you probably should have seen it coming. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "No, but I should have been more careful." "We both should have been more careful," she said. "Now we know, so we're more careful." He looked at her. "It doesn't bother you?" "Of course it bothers me," she said. It bothers me, and I'm going to keep working anyway because being bothered and stopping aren't the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. You say things like that, he said, and I think about how Crow had you cornered in the street in October with $2 to your name. He didn't have me cornered, she said. No, Gideon agreed. He really didn't. Bull. The letter from Charles Fenn arrived in the third week of April. It was longer than the first one, 4 pages, and it was not in careful corporate language. It was direct. The Western Pacific's Independent Geological Survey, conducted in early April, had confirmed Webb's findings. The deposit assessment had been shared with the railroad's principal investors. There was significant interest in the mineral rights and in establishing a freight and extraction partnership. More importantly, and this was the part that Evelyn read 3 times, the railroad had shared Evelyn's timeline document and Daniel's letters with a federal land fraud investigator in Cheyenne. That investigator had opened a formal inquiry. The words formal inquiry sat on the page and meant everything. Formal meant documented. Formal meant Crow's name in federal files. Formal meant the thing she'd been trying to build for 6 months had its foundation now, and Crow could no longer make it disappear through local pressure or local connections, because it was no longer local. She was sitting on the porch steps in the April sun when she finished reading. The yard was loud with the mill running, and the birds that had come back with the warmer weather, and Pete Jarvis arguing cheerfully with someone about the angle of a timber cut. Gideon came around the corner of the workshop and saw her sitting there with the letter. He stopped. Good or bad, he said. Yeah, she held it out. He crossed the yard and took it and read it standing up, the way Asa Webb had read the geological report. She watched his face while he read, which she rarely allowed herself to do. She saw the moment he reached the part about the federal inquiry. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, because they'd been aiming for this, but something that looked like the particular relief of a person who has been braced against a wall for a long time and finally feels the pressure ease. He lowered the letter. Federal, he said. Federal, she confirmed. Crow's sheriff is worthless to him now. Worthless, she said. His local lawyers, too. The county judge. She stood up. He's been operating on the assumption that this stays local, that it's a property dispute between him and a widow with no resources and no connections. That assumption is now incorrect. Gideon looked at the letter again. He's going to find out soon. He might already know. Men like Crow have ears in Cheyenne. She took the letter back from him and folded it. When he finds out, he's going to panic. And when he panics, he does something drastic, Gideon said. Yes. He looked at her. The sun was coming at a low angle across the yard, hitting the side of his face, and he was squinting against it in that habitual way. He'd been out working since 6. There was sawdust in his beard and a new cut on his right hand from something he hadn't mentioned. I need to tell you something, he said. The shift in his voice was subtle, but she caught it. She waited. I got a message yesterday, he said, from a man in Iron Ridge who isn't exactly a friend, but isn't Crow's either. He said Crow's been meeting with men from outside the territory. Not investors, not lawyers. He paused. Armed men. The yard noise continued around them, indifferent. How many? She said. He didn't know exactly. 6, maybe 8. She was quiet for a moment. When? He didn't know that either, but the meetings had been happening for 2 weeks. She looked at the letter in her hand. Then she looked up at the mountain above the property, the long north face, the ridgeline she could see from her window every morning. Somewhere beneath that ridgeline, $4 million worth of silver sat in the dark and waited. He's going to try to take the deed, she said. Yes. By force. That's my read. She turned this over. Crow was desperate, and he was running out of time, and he was a man who had always operated on the principle that force, applied correctly, solved problems that money and patience couldn't. He'd applied it to Daniel. He'd tried to apply it through commercial pressure to her. Now he was going to try the direct version. We need to send the evidence, she said. Gideon looked at her. What? Everything I've compiled. The full documentation package, the letters, the timeline, Webb's report, Fenn's letter, all of it. Copies. She was already moving toward the door. To Fenn? To the federal investigator in Cheyenne, and she stopped. Who are the Western Pacific's principal investors? Do you know any of them personally? I know one, a man named Aldridge out of Denver. He's been trying to break into this territory for years. Crow blocked him twice on land deals. Does he hate Crow? Gideon almost smiled. Very much. Write to him. Today. Tell him what's happening and tell him that if Crow moves against us by force, it needs to be on record immediately afterward that there are federal and private interests already engaged with this situation. She was thinking as she talked, the pieces arranging themselves in front of her the way numbers did in a ledger when the pattern suddenly became clear. Crow thinks he can still make this disappear. He thinks if he gets the deed and destroys me, the whole thing goes back to being a local story about a widow who made accusations and then gave up. We have to make sure that isn't true. Every person who matters has to already know before he moves. You want to take away his exits, Gideon said. I want to make sure that the moment he does something violent, it happens inside a context that he can't control and can't erase. She met his eyes. I've been building toward this for 6 months. I am not going to let him take it away from us because I didn't finish the job. Something moved in Gideon's face. She couldn't hold it in focus long enough to name it. Start writing, he said quietly. I'll get Caleb to prep the horses for dispatch. The next 2 weeks were the most deliberately exhausting of Evelyn's life. She wrote until her hand ached, and then she kept writing. She organized documents into 7 separate packages, 6 copies of the full evidence bundle and 1 master set she kept at the property, and dispatched them via 2 different routes to make interception difficult. She wrote to Charles Fenn. She wrote to the federal investigator, a man named Harlan Cole, whose name appeared in Fenn's correspondence, and she wrote it not as a request for help but as a formal witness statement, signed and dated, describing every event she could document from Daniel's death forward. She wrote to the Western Pacific's Denver investors through Gideon's contact Aldridge. That letter was different, harder to write, because she had to make a business case and an emotional case simultaneously without letting either one undermine the other. She spent 3 evenings on it. Gideon read 2 drafts and said very little except once, after the second draft. The part about Daniel, leave that in. Don't cut it for being too personal. It's not too personal. It's why any of this matters. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said, and left it in. While she wrote, Gideon prepared the property. He didn't talk about it in detail. He was not the kind of man who announced what he was doing, but she noticed the changes. The workers began rotating their shifts differently, with more overlap at the vulnerable hours. 2 additional men arrived from Laramie, quiet and capable looking, whom Gideon introduced simply as experienced hands without elaborating. The supply route up the mountain had 2 alternates now, mapped and cleared. There were provisions enough for 4 weeks inside the main house if they needed them. Pete Jarvis stopped Evelyn one afternoon at the wheelhouse and said, without looking at her directly, "You know what he's building, right?" "A defensive position?" she said. Pete nodded. "He's done it before. When Crow sent those men 4 years ago, before you came, it got bad up here for a while." He paused. Gideon never backed down then either. She looked at the old man. "Were you here then?" "I've been here since the beginning," Pete said. "Since his father's time." He looked at the wheel, turning steadily in the spring-swollen creek. "The mountain's worth defending. Always has been." She thought about that for a long time afterward. And then, in the first week of May, Gideon came into the kitchen in the early morning with his coat already on and his face carrying the particular closed expression that meant something had happened. "Ryder came up at dawn," he said. "From town. A man named Cutler. He's been reliable before." Evelyn put down her pen. "Crow's moving," Gideon said. "Today or tomorrow. Cutler counted 9 men riding out of Iron Ridge yesterday evening. Armed. Crow was with them." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at the window. Outside, the May morning was pale gold, the yard already in motion, the mountain above the property sharp and clear against a cold blue sky. She thought about October, the boardwalk, the split boot sole, the $2, Crow's composed face, and the offer that was not really an offer. Do you want to survive, or do you want to prove them wrong? She stood up. "Then we're ready," she said. Gideon watched her. "I need to send 1 more letter," she said, "to Harlan Cole in Cheyenne. Immediate dispatch." She was already pulling paper. "He needs to know it's happening now, not in a week, not after the fact. Now, while there's still time to move." "The writer who brought the message can turn around," Gideon said. He knows the fast route. Get him. While Gideon went out, she wrote. She wrote quickly and precisely, the way she'd written the quarterly accounts by lamplight in the middle of the night back in November. Not panicked, not rushed, just focused down to the single necessary thing. She told Cole what was coming. She told him the location. She told him what was at stake and who had documentation of all of it and where those documents were held. She signed it. She sealed it. She addressed it to Harlan Cole, federal land fraud investigator, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. And then she wrote a second line at the bottom of the envelope. Urgent. Lives at risk. Please move. The rider took it at a gallop. Evelyn stood in the yard and watched him go until the trail bent and the trees took him. The mill was running behind her, the water wheel turning, the mountain solid under the morning sky. She turned around and went back to work. There was still preparation to do, and she intended for every piece of it to be ready. They came at dawn. Evelyn heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses on the upper trail, more than a few, moving at a pace that wasn't casual. She was already up. She'd been up since 3, not because she'd planned to be, but because sleep had stopped being available somewhere around midnight, and she'd given up pretending otherwise. She'd spent the dark hours sitting at the kitchen table with coffee she didn't taste, going over the same mental inventory she'd been running for days. Documents sent, riders dispatched, positions prepared, every piece where it needed to be. She went to the window. The May dawn was coming in gray and cold over the eastern ridge, the sky just beginning to separate from the mountain line. The yard was still in shadow. The mill was quiet, the water wheel turning slowly in the reduced morning flow of the creek. Then the first rider cleared the tree line at the upper edge of the property. Then 3 more behind him. Then Crow himself, on a dark horse, wearing his long coat, hat pulled low against the morning chill. And behind him, in a loose line, 6 more men with rifles across their saddles. 9 total. Cutler's count had been accurate. Evelyn turned from the window. She put on her coat. She picked up Daniel's hat from the peg beside the door. The faded wool hat she'd kept through everything, the one that still held the shape of his head, and put it on. Then she took the rifle from the corner where Gideon had placed it 2 days ago and checked the load the way he'd shown her, which she'd practiced until it was automatic. She went to Gideon's door and knocked once. "They're here," she said. A short pause. "How many?" "9, Crow's with them." She heard him move. When he came out, he was dressed and his own rifle was in his hand, and his face had the particular settled quality she'd learned to recognize. So, not calm exactly, but resolved, the expression of a man who has made every decision he needed to make and is now simply present for what follows. He looked at her. His eyes went to the rifle, then to her face. "The loft," he said. "I know." They'd discussed this. The main house had a storage loft that ran along the south wall, with 2 small windows that looked out over the yard. High ground, covered position, clear sight lines across the entire property. "I'll be in the yard," he said. "Don't do anything before they state their business," she said. "I know how this works." "Gideon," she held his gaze. "We need him to make the threat publicly, on record, in front of witnesses." She tilted her head toward the bunkhouse, where she knew the mill workers were awake and watching. "That's the only way this ends the way it needs to end." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "But the moment it goes past words, I'll handle myself." His jaw moved. He didn't argue. She went up to the loft. Back. From the loft window, she had a clear view of the whole yard. Below, she watched Gideon walk out from the main house and stand in the center of the open ground, rifle at his side but not raised, facing the line of riders who'd arranged themselves in a loose arc across the upper edge of the property. Pete Jarvis had appeared at the door of the wheelhouse. Caleb and 2 others were visible at the edge of the mill building. The 2 additional men Gideon had brought up from Laramie were positioned at opposite ends of the yard in places that were not accidental. Crow walked his horse forward from the line. He stopped 20 feet from Gideon and looked at the property with the expression of a man conducting an appraisal, measuring, calculating, finding things wanting. "Blackwood," he said. His voice carried easily in the still morning air. "Crow," Gideon said. "I'm going to need to speak with Mrs. Harper." "She's not here," Gideon said. It was not technically a lie. She was in the loft. Crow smiled at it anyway. "I think she is." He looked at the main house window, which was empty. "I'll give her the courtesy of stating my business plainly. I'm here to take possession of the Northern Parcel Deed, Survey Section 14, Parcel 7. The transfer is necessary for the resolution of an outstanding financial dispute connected to the estate of her late husband. That's a new framing, Gideon said. It's a legal one. No, it isn't. Gideon's voice was flat. There is no outstanding financial dispute. There is a deed that belongs to Evelyn Harper, properly registered with the Territorial Land Office, against which no legitimate competing claim has ever been filed. He paused. You know that, which is why you're here with 9 men instead of a lawyer. Something shifted on Crow's face. Not anger. Crow was too controlled for simple anger. Something colder. The expression of a man recalculating. I've been patient, Crow said. I gave her a fair offer. I gave her time. She's made decisions that have complicated matters considerably, and I'm here to uncomplicate them. He looked around the property. Nobody has to get hurt. I want the deed, and then I want her gone from this territory. That's the end of it. The end of it, Gideon said. Yes. Like the end of it was for Daniel Harper. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the water wheel seemed to slow. Crow's face went very still. Daniel Harper died in a mining accident, he said, each word placed carefully. That has been formally established. By your sheriff, Gideon said, in your town, where you own everything that matters. Blackwood? His wife found his letters. Gideon's voice didn't rise. The ones he wrote before he died, the ones where he described finding the silver deposit and then described you finding out about it. He paused. Those letters are currently in the possession of a federal land fraud investigator in Cheyenne, along with a geological survey confirming the deposit and 6 months of documented evidence of your campaign against her. Another pause. So, when you say nobody has to get hurt, you should understand that the hurt has already been calculated and put into official record. Whatever you do here this morning doesn't change that. Crow said nothing. Russ Holt, on Crow's left, shifted his horse forward slightly. His hand was on his rifle. Brett Donnelly, on the right, had already moved his weapon off the saddle and was holding it with the particular casual readiness that meant he was waiting for a signal. Evelyn looked at the scene below her and made a decision. She pushed the loft window open. The sound of it, the creak of old wood in the morning quiet, made several of the riders look up. She stepped forward so she was visible in the frame, the rifle in her right hand, the pale dawn light coming in behind her. Every face in the yard turned. Crow looked up at her. For just one moment, one fraction of a second that she caught and held, his composure broke, not dramatically, not obviously, but she saw it. The flicker of something he hadn't planned for. She'd been planning this for 6 months. He'd been planning this for 2 weeks. That was the difference. Mr. Crow, she said. Her voice was steady. She'd thought it might shake, and it didn't. I've heard you state your business. He recovered quickly. She had to give him that. Mrs. Harper, come down and let's discuss this like reasonable adults. I'm comfortable where I am. She looked past him at the men arranged across the yard. I want everyone here to understand what is happening this morning. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am the legal owner of the Northern Mountain Parcel, Survey Section 14, Parcel 7. The man below me is Silas Crow, who arranged the death of my husband to obtain that parcel, and who has arrived this morning with 9 armed men because he has no legal mechanism to take what doesn't belong to him. That's enough, Crow said. I'm not finished. She met his eyes from the loft window. Every word I've just said is documented in federal records in Cheyenne. A federal investigator named Harlan Cole has been notified that this confrontation was likely and has been given the location and the date. She paused. Whatever you do in this yard in the next few minutes, Mr. Crow, there is no version of it that disappears. There is no version of it that this territory's sheriff can rule on and close. It is already federal. It was already federal before you rode up this mountain. Crow's horse moved beneath him, and he pulled it still with a sharp hand. You think a few letters to Cheyenne are going to stop? I think they already have, she said. I think you know that. I think that's why you came today instead of waiting. Because you know you're running out of time, and this is the last move you have left. She looked at him steadily. It's not enough, Silas. It was never going to be enough. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She'd done it deliberately. Crow turned to Holt, and something passed between them. A look, a fraction of a nod. Holt's hand tightened on his rifle. Evelyn, Gideon's voice from below. Not loud, just a warning. She was already moving back from the window, pressing against the loft walls. The shot came. Not from Holt, from Donnelly, the younger one, the impatient one, the one who always acted before he thought. The sound of it cracked across the yard and the window frame splintered where she'd been standing 2 seconds before. Below, everything moved at once. Gideon dropped and came up behind the corner of the workshop in one motion. The 2 men from Laramie moved from their positions. Pete Jarvis had disappeared into the wheelhouse and reappeared with a shotgun that Evelyn had not known he possessed and had apparently had for years on the basis that the mountain warranted it. Crow's riders were not a unified force. That was what happened when you hired men quickly and for money rather than loyalty. They did the calculation in a crisis, and the calculation changed. 2 of them pulled their horses back immediately. One moved forward, the rest held uncertain ground. Donnelly had fired, and now he was the most exposed person in the yard, sitting on a horse in the open with Gideon's rifle pointed at him from behind the workshop corner and Pete Jarvis's shotgun pointed at him from the wheelhouse door. He went very still. "Put it down," Gideon said. It was the same voice he'd used the first time Evelyn saw him, the one that didn't need to be loud. "Now." Donnelly's rifle went down across the saddle. Crow turned to look at the situation around him with the expression of a man whose careful count of the variables has come out wrong. "Crow." Gideon came out from behind the workshop, rifle up. "Get off the horse." "You're making a serious mistake. I've heard that before. Get off the horse." Crow didn't move. Holt moved instead, a fast reach for his weapon that didn't complete because Caleb, of all people, young Caleb, who'd made the production error back in November and hadn't made it since, stepped from behind the mill building and put a rifle to Holt's back with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Don't," Caleb said. Holt's hand moved away from his rifle. The yard was quiet again. The water wheel turned. The cold morning light had shifted while the confrontation happened, the sun clearing the eastern ridge now, hitting the yard in long pale strips. Evelyn came down from the loft. She walked out through the main house door and crossed the yard and stood in the center of it, in the same spot Gideon had stood when the riders arrived. She looked at Crow on his horse, surrounded and still, his 9 men reduced by circumstances to a problem rather than a force. He looked at her. His composed face was holding, but barely. There was something underneath it she'd never seen before. Not fear exactly. Something adjacent to fear. The particular expression of a powerful man who has just understood that he is no longer powerful. "It's over," she said. Crow said nothing. "You're going to want to wait for the federal officers," she said. "Because if you ride out of here, you'll be running, and that's going to make everything that comes next significantly worse for you. You have no authority. I have every document ever written about what you've done," she said. "I have a geological report. I have my husband's letters. I have 6 months of your interference cataloged and dated and witnessed." She looked at him steadily. "I have the truth, Mr. Crow. I've had it since November. I've just been waiting until enough other people had it too." She turned to Gideon. "Keep them here." He looked at her. "Where are you going?" "To wait," she said. "He'll come." She went back to the main house and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where she'd first spread Daniel's letters out, where she'd written contract drafts and quarterly accounts and evidence packages and letters to federal investigators in Cheyenne. She put her hands flat on the surface of it and breathed. The rifle she set against the wall. She sat there for 2 hours. She could hear the yard outside, the horses, the occasional voice, Gideon's quiet directions, the sound of men who had expected one outcome and gotten another, waiting in the May morning with nowhere to go. She made coffee. She drank it at the table. She thought about Daniel at this same kind of table, in their old kitchen, tracing property lines on a deed. "Maybe," he'd said. She thought, "You were right. You were right about everything, and it cost you everything, and I am going to make sure it means something." She thought she'd said that before. She probably had. It bore repeating. The sound she'd been waiting for came at 8:30. Horses on the trail. More than a few. A different rhythm from Crow's men. Organized, deliberate. She went to the window. 8 riders came through the tree line at the upper edge of the property. They wore no uniforms, but they carried themselves with the specific bearing of men operating under federal authority and at the front of them was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with gray at his temples and the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal and were not easily surprised. Harlan Cole. She knew it before he said his name. She'd written to him enough times to recognize a man who read the way he wrote. Direct, comprehensive, with nothing wasted. He swept the yard as he rode in, taking in Crow on his horse. The men held in position around the yard, Gideon standing at the center of it all with a rifle at ease. Cole pulled up his horse and looked at Gideon. "Blackwood?" "Yes," Gideon said. Cole nodded. He looked at Crow. Then he looked toward the main house, where Evelyn was standing in the doorway. He dismounted and walked toward her. "Mrs. Harper," he said. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Your letter was persuasive." He glanced back at the yard. "I see we weren't too late." "No," she said. "You weren't." He looked at her for a moment. The direct assessing look of someone who has been reading a person's correspondence for months and is now making sense of the gap between the words and the actual human being. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy something. "I need to take statements," he said, "starting with yours." "I have documentation ready," she said. "Everything." "I know you do," he said. "I've read most of it." He almost smiled. "Thorough work, Mrs. Harper." She stepped aside to let him in. What happened in the following hours was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was methodical. Cole and his men moved through the yard with the organized efficiency of a process that had been set in motion long before this morning and was now simply completing itself. Statements were taken. Men were questioned separately. Crow was brought off his horse by two of Cole's people and spoke briefly to a man with a ledger who wrote everything down without expression. Holt was placed under formal custody within the first hour. The evidence connecting him to Daniel's mine inspection, the falsified records, the altered safety reports, his name in Daniel's last letter, was substantial enough that Cole moved on him fast. Donnelly, who had actually fired a shot this morning, was in a worse position than anyone. The rest of Crow's men, when they understood what was happening, when they understood that this was federal, that the documentation existed, that the sheriff in Iron Ridge had no jurisdiction here, began one by one to make themselves cooperative. It was not courageous. It was simple arithmetic. They'd been hired by a man who was now demonstrably collapsing, and the calculation had changed. Crow himself said very little. He stood in the yard in his expensive coat and let the morning sun work its way across the mountain and said almost nothing except to a man he identified as his attorney, whispered urgently for a quarter of an hour. Evelyn watched him from the main house doorway and felt not triumph exactly. Not the clean satisfaction she'd imagined during the months of planning. Something more complicated than that. The thing about getting what you've worked for is that it comes attached to everything you paid to get it, and the payment in this case had been Daniel, and that was not a simple thing to stand next to. She was standing in the doorway still when Cole came back out of the house with the last of his note-taking finished and stood beside her. "He'll be charged in Cheyenne," Cole said. "The murder charge against your husband's case, I want to be honest with you, that's going to be difficult to prove to a criminal standard. The mine collapse was 2 years ago, and the direct evidence is circumstantial." He paused. "But the fraud charges are solid. The land theft documentation is solid. The commercial intimidation against you is documented well enough that his legal exposure is significant." She nodded. She'd known this. She'd known from the beginning that the murder charge was the hardest mountain to climb, that courts needed different things than she needed, that there was a version of justice that would leave her unsatisfied and still be justice. "His name," she said, "Daniel's name. The claim that he stole from the company, will that be addressed?" Cole looked at her. "As part of the fraud proceedings, yes. The false accusations against your husband are part of Crow's pattern of conduct. The record will reflect that the theft claims were fabricated." She was quiet. "It won't bring him back," Cole said. Not unkindly, just directly. "No," she said. "It won't." She looked at the yard where Crow was being prepared for transport. He was putting on his hat, a precise, composed gesture, even now. She supposed that was who he was. The composure was the deepest layer of him. He looked up and found her eyes before he turned toward the horses. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The saying of it had been done. in ledgers and letters and geological reports, and a 40-page timeline document that was sitting in federal files in Cheyenne and wasn't going anywhere. The saying of it was complete. He looked away first. She watched him ride out with Cole's men on either side of him, down the trail, through the tree line, gone. Holt behind him, Donnelly, the rest of the hired riders, dispersing. The yard emptied slowly. Pete Jarvis appeared at the wheelhouse with his shotgun over his shoulder like he'd had it there all morning, which he probably had, and looked at the gate through which Crow had disappeared with the expression of a man satisfied with how the day had gone. Caleb was talking to one of Cole's officers about the sequence of events this morning, gesturing at the positions around the yard with the detailed enthusiasm of someone who'd been in the middle of something significant and wanted to make sure the record was accurate. Gideon came and stood beside her. They stood there for a while without saying anything, looking at the yard, the mountain above the property, the spring sky. Cole says the fraud charges are solid, she said. Good. The murder charge is harder. He was honest about that. Gideon nodded. Daniel's name? Will be cleared as part of the proceedings. He was quiet for a moment. That matters. Yes, she said. It does. The water wheel turned in the creek. Somewhere in the mill building, someone had started working. The sound of a saw beginning its run, ordinary and good. The Western Pacific attorney sent a follow-up message, she said. Before all this, I meant to tell you, but the morning got away from me. They want to move forward on the mineral rights partnership. They're proposing a formal agreement within 60 days. Gideon looked at her. And I think we should take it, she paused. With conditions. Our conditions. I want the extraction operation structured so it doesn't compromise the timber business. I want the water rights clearly separated from the mineral rights. And I want the initial terms reviewed by someone in Cheyenne who doesn't owe either side a favor. He was quiet for a moment. You've already been thinking about the terms. I've been thinking about them since February, she said. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, the almost laugh. She looked at him sideways. What? Nothing, he said, which was what he usually said when he meant something. Gideon. He looked at her. In the morning light, with the long winter and the hard spring behind them both, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had built something difficult in a difficult place, who had made room for her in it without making it a performance, who had stood in the center of a yard with 9 armed men coming down the mountain and not moved an inch. You did this, he said. We did this. No. He shook his head, not arguing but clarifying. You built the case. You sent the letters. You put the pieces in places where they couldn't be ignored. He paused. I helped, but this was yours. She didn't know what to do with that entirely. She'd spent a year being told what she was. A thief's widow, a problem, a person to be removed or discarded. Having someone say this was yours in a way that meant the victory was yours. The strength was yours. The thing you built was real. She didn't have a quick and easy response to that. Daniel would have, she started. Daniel found the silver, Gideon said quietly. You found the way to use it. She looked at the mountain above the property, the north face, where the deposit sat 60 feet down in the dark, waiting. The land Daniel had bought in small payments over 5 years because he believed in something he couldn't fully see. She believed in it now. She'd seen the numbers, she'd read Webb's report, she'd held the geological confirmation in her hands and understood what it meant. It meant Daniel had been right. All of it, everything. She pressed her lips together. I'm going to need a larger office, she said finally, and her voice was steady, and it was only slightly a deflection. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I'll build you one, he said, simply, like a fact about what was going to happen next. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountain, his jaw set, the permanent squint against the morning light. Something moved in her chest. Not the grief for once, or not only the grief. Something else that had been growing for months in the spaces between ledgers and letters and long evenings at the kitchen table. Something she hadn't let herself look at directly until this moment. She didn't look at it directly now either, but she didn't look away from it entirely either. Good, she said. The saw in the mill kept running. The wheel kept turning. Pete Jarvis walked back to his wheelhouse and disappeared inside it, and the mountain held everything under its sky, indifferent and enormous, and exactly what it had always been. Somewhere beneath the upper bench, $4 million of silver sat in the dark. Evelyn Harper had a deed in her coat pocket, a federal case in motion in Cheyenne, and a 60-day window to negotiate the best terms anyone in this territory had ever gotten from a railroad. She went inside to make coffee and get back to work. The Cheyenne proceedings took 4 months. Evelyn made the trip down twice, once in June for her formal deposition, once in August when Crow's attorney attempted to file a counterclaim against the deed that Cole's office needed her present to refute. Both times she rode down with the document case across her knees and came back with something resolved that hadn't been resolved before. And both times the mountain felt different when she returned to it. Larger, somehow, more permanent. The fraud charges held exactly as Cole had said they would. Crow's financial records, subpoenaed and examined by federal accountants who had no connection to Iron Ridge or anyone in it, told a story that his composed face never had. Years of falsified supply contracts, land acquisition through manufactured debt, 3 separate instances of safety record alteration at the mine, the last of which corresponded directly to the date of Daniel's collapse. That last piece was what broke the composure, finally. Not the fraud charges, not the land theft, not the documented campaign against Evelyn. It was sitting in a federal proceeding room in Cheyenne, watching an accountant read aloud from safety records that had been altered in Crow's own handwriting 3 weeks before a mine collapse that killed 1 man and was ruled an accident. Evelyn was present for that session. She'd asked Cole if she could be, and he'd said yes, and she'd sat in the back of the room with her hands folded on the table in front of her and listened to every word. It didn't bring Daniel back. She'd known it wouldn't, but there was something in hearing it stated plainly. In an official room, by an official process, with a federal clerk writing it all down, that was different from knowing it herself in a barn in October with $2 and a worn-out pair of boots. The truth had weight when it was witnessed. It meant something different when it was on record and couldn't be taken back. Crow was sentenced in September. Fraud, land theft, falsification of safety records. The murder charge, Cole had been honest about this from the beginning, could not be proven to the criminal standard required. The evidence was circumstantial. The mine was 2 years gone. The men who might have testified directly had scattered or closed ranks. It wasn't everything. Evelyn had always known it wouldn't be everything. But Crow went to prison. Russ Holt went to prison. Brett Donnelly, who had fired a rifle in a yard full of witnesses, including 2 federal officers paid informants, went to prison for the longest of the 3. And in the formal record of the proceedings, entered into evidence and read aloud in that Cheyenne room, was a statement from the federal fraud investigator that the accusations of theft leveled against Daniel James Harper in the months following his death had been fabricated as part of a systematic effort to discredit his widow and suppress her legal claim to property. Fabricated. That was the word the record used. Not mistaken. Not unsubstantiated. Fabricated. Evelyn wrote that word in her private journal that night, in the small room she'd taken at a Cheyenne boarding house. She wrote it, and then she sat with the journal open on the table and didn't write anything else for a long time. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the way he'd been talked about in Iron Ridge for the year after his death. The pitying looks at her, the way people had dropped their eyes, the specific cruelty of a reputation destroyed in a place too small to escape it. She thought about how she'd carried that on top of everything else, the grief plus the shame of a name that wasn't even true. It was corrected now, officially, permanently. She closed the journal. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in months, which was not the same as sleeping well, but was something. She came back to the mountain in late September to find it in full autumn color. The aspens gone gold along the lower ridges, the higher timber still green against a sky that had sharpened with the first cold of the season. The yard smelled like wood smoke and fresh-cut pine and the particular mineral tang of the creek, which had dropped back to its autumn level after the snowmelt months. The new office was finished. Gideon had built it himself. Not entirely. He'd had Caleb and 2 others helping, but the framing and the interior work he'd done with his own hands. It was attached to the south wall of the main house, a proper room with 2 windows, a stone floor, built-in shelving along the east wall, and a stove of its own so she could work through the winter without the kitchen table between her and everything else. She stood in the doorway of it when she got back and looked at the shelving and the windows and the stove, and she said nothing for a moment. Gideon was standing behind her, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. She could feel him trying not to make a thing of it. "It's good work," she said. "Caleb did most of the shelving," he said, which was not entirely true, and she knew it. She turned around and looked at him directly. He met her eyes and then looked at a point slightly past her ear, which was what he did when he was managing something he didn't want to be obvious about. "Thank you," she said. "It's practical," he said. "You needed a proper space." "Gideon." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said again. "Meaning, for this. For October. For not treating me like a problem to be managed or a victim to be protected. For the coffee at 2 a.m. For standing in the center of a yard with 9 armed men coming down the mountain. For saying this was yours when it would have been easier and probably more comfortable to say something smaller." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not the small, almost smile, but something quieter than that and less defended. "You're welcome," he said. It was the simplest exchange they'd ever had, which made it the most complicated. She turned back to the new office before either of them said anything else, and started moving her things from the kitchen table. The Western Pacific Agreement was finalized in November, 13 months after Evelyn had first walked up the mountain trail with a split boot sole and nothing but a deed and her husband's wool hat. The terms were hers. Not entirely. Negotiations never produce entirely, but substantially. The mineral extraction operation would be structured as a separate entity from the timber business, with clearly delineated water rights that protected the mill. The railroad took a 40% stake in the extraction in exchange for financing the initial bore and infrastructure. Evelyn held 60% and retained full operational control. The timber contracts, renegotiated simultaneously, locked in pricing at a premium that would have seemed impossible 18 months ago. Charles Fenn came up the mountain in person to sign the final documents. He sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn's office table now, properly speaking, but the kitchen was where the serious things still happened, and went through the agreement page by page with the methodical care she'd come to expect from him. When it was done, he set his pen down and looked at her. "I've been doing this work for 20 years, he said. "I don't think I've seen a negotiation conducted from a worse starting position produce a better outcome." "The position wasn't as bad as it looked," she said. "You had no money, no legal representation, and an active campaign being run against you by the primary power in the region," Fenn said. "That's a fairly bad starting position, Mrs. Harper." She thought about it. "I had the land, I had Daniel's letters, and I had—" She glanced at Gideon, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his own copy of the agreement. "I had a partner who understood what the mountain was worth." Fenn looked between them. "Well," he said, and left it at that, with the diplomatic restraint of a man who understood when he was adjacent to something that wasn't his business. He stayed one night and rode out the following morning. Evelyn watched him go from the porch, the document case with the signed agreement inside now sitting on her office shelf where it would stay. She stood there for a while after Fenn had gone. The November air was cold and sharp, and the mountain above the property was dusted with the first snow of the season, a thin early layer that hadn't settled yet, still shifting in the wind off the ridge. Pete Jarvis came around from the wheelhouse and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He nodded once with the particular satisfaction of a man who has outlasted a great deal and recognizes the completion of something real. "Good," he said, and went back to his wheel. Iron Ridge found out about the agreement through the territorial newspaper, which ran a brief item in December about the Western Pacific's new mineral extraction partnership in the Northern Mountain Range. The item named Evelyn Harper as the primary rights holder. It mentioned the geological survey and the deposit estimate. It did not mention Silas Crow, who was by then in a federal facility in Laramie, and whose name people in Iron Ridge had started to say with the particular quietness reserved for things that turned out badly. Evelyn learned about the newspaper item from a letter sent by Mabel Garrett, the woman who'd turned her away at the hotel laundry door, the one who'd said, "I can't, Evelyn, you know how it is." The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph congratulated her on the mining agreement. The second said that several of the town's business owners were interested in discussing supply and freight arrangements with the Blackwood operation. The third was a careful, slightly awkward attempt at an apology that didn't quite use the word sorry, but circled around it several times. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she wrote back. She said she appreciated the good wishes and that she was open to discussing business arrangements through proper channels. She did not address the third paragraph directly. She was not interested in performing forgiveness for people who'd had choices and made the easy one. But she wasn't interested in carrying grievances either. Grievances were weight, and she'd already been carrying more than her share. She filed Mabel's letter and moved on. What Iron Ridge thought about her was no longer a thing she organized her life around. That had changed somewhere on the mountain, gradually, the way the most important changes happen. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of mornings where you got up and did the work, and went to bed and got up again, until the version of yourself that needed the town's approval was simply gone, replaced by someone who had better things to think about. December brought the real snow, and with it the slower pace of winter operations, and with that the first sustained quiet the mountain had offered in over a year. Evelyn used it for things she'd been postponing. She reorganized the filing system for the combined timber and mineral operation, a significant undertaking that took 2 weeks and produced a structure she was genuinely proud of, the kind of clean, logical architecture that made her father's voice in her head say, "That's right. That's how you do it." She wrote a formal business plan for the next 3 years, which Gideon read carefully over 2 evenings and marked in 3 places with questions that were good questions, the kind that made her sharpen her thinking. She also, one afternoon in the second week of December, went up to the northern parcel alone. It was a clear day, cold, but not punishing, the snow packed firm enough to walk on without sinking. She went up the trail she'd learned over the past year, past the landmarks she knew now, the doubled pine at the first switchback, the exposed granite shelf at the ridge, the long south-facing bench where the light came in longest. She stood on the upper bench and looked at the ground. Somewhere below her feet, 60 feet down in the dark rock, was what Daniel had found, what he'd spent months quietly documenting in letters he'd never meant to send her, written to himself, working out loud on paper the way he always had. She thought about him standing in this same spot, probably in summer, given the timing, looking at the surface indicators, taking his measurements, knowing what it meant and not yet knowing what it would cost him. He'd been a careful man, a patient man, not a perfect man. He'd had a temper sometimes, and a stubbornness that could outlast reason, and a habit of leaving things half-finished around the house that had driven her slightly insane for years. But he'd been honest, deeply, consistently, sometimes inconveniently honest. And he'd been right about this place when everyone else had called it worthless. She stayed on the bench for a while. The wind moved across the slope. Far below, she could hear the faint sound of the mill, the water wheel, the ordinary noise of the operation running. She didn't talk to him. She wasn't that kind of person. But she thought, I know you were right, and everyone else is going to know it too. She walked back down in the late afternoon light, the snow turning gold under the low sun, the mountain holding its particular winter silence around her. She and Gideon had the argument about the spring expansion plan in January. It was a real argument, the kind that left both of them sitting at opposite ends of the kitchen in deliberate silence for 20 minutes before either of them was ready to talk again. She wanted to move faster on the Boer infrastructure. He thought the timeline was too aggressive for the mountain's seasonal constraints. She thought he was being overly cautious. He thought she was letting ambition override judgment. They were both partly right. She knew that going in. She knew it during. She said things that were sharper than they needed to be, and she saw him receive them and say things back that were equally sharp and equally partly valid. And the whole conversation was uncomfortable in the specific way that arguments are uncomfortable when they're with someone whose opinion you actually respect. When the silence finally broke, she broke it, because she'd been the one to push the argument to that point, and she knew it. She said, "The August timeline, we split the difference." He looked at her from across the kitchen. "The Boer starts June," she said. "Infrastructure completion August. I'm not going to July because July is unrealistic, and I knew that when I said it." "Why did you say it then?" She considered that for a moment. "Because I wanted June, and I knew you'd say June was too early." A very long pause. The bore starts June, he said. Infrastructure August. Yes? That's what you wanted the whole time. More or less. He made the almost laugh sound. It was slightly more of a laugh than it usually was. You're difficult, he said, not unkindly. You knew that in October, she said. You offered me the job anyway. I did, he said, and looked at the table for a moment and the thing that had been between them for months, the thing neither of them had named yet, sat in the kitchen with them in the January cold, present and patient, waiting for whenever they were ready to deal with it. She wasn't entirely ready. She wasn't sure she'd ever be entirely ready. Grief didn't work on a schedule and she'd stopped expecting it to. But ready and willing were not the same thing, and she understood this clearly, sitting across a kitchen table from a man who argued with her like she was worth arguing with. Willing. I'm going to need help with the extraction business plan, she said. The operational sections. I know the numbers, but you know the mountain. I know, he said. We'd need to work on it together. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes without looking past her ear this time. All right, she said. All right, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic gesture. It was two people who had been through something genuinely hard deciding to keep going in the same direction, which is, if you think about it honestly, what most real things are made of. The bore began in June, on schedule. The first confirmed strike came 6 weeks in. The foreman, a capable man named Soren brought up from the Laramie mining district, sent word to Evelyn's office on a Tuesday afternoon with a single line. We found it. It's real. It's big. She read the note standing at her office window. She held it for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the shelf beside the deed and Fenn's signed agreement and Daniel's letters, the originals in their oilcloth wrapping, and she went outside. Gideon was at the mill. She found him there and handed him Soren's note without saying anything. He read it. He handed it back. He looked at her. Well, he said. Well, she said. The sun was high, and the mountain was loud with summer. The birds and the creek and the mill running, and the bore team's equipment going on the upper bench. And the sky above the ridgeline was the particular deep blue that only exists at altitude, a blue so clean it looks like it was made separately from the rest of the world. She folded Soren's note and put it in her coat pocket. Busy summer, she said. Yes, he said. Very busy summer. They stood there in the yard for a moment, side by side, not touching, looking up at the mountain that Daniel had believed in, that Crow had killed for, that Evelyn had spent 14 months fighting to hold. It was hers. The numbers said so. The federal record said so. The deed said so. But more than any of that, she knew it in the way that you know something real, in the bones, in the working knowledge of mornings and seasons, in the particular understanding that comes from having bled for a place until it becomes part of you. She thought about the woman who'd stood on the main street of Iron Ridge in a split boot sole with $2 and a deed everyone said was worthless. She thought about what that woman had needed. Not saving, not pity, not someone to solve it for her. Just a question. Just, do you want to survive or do you want to prove them wrong? She hadn't known, that morning, that the answer would cost this much. She also hadn't known what it would build. That was the thing nobody told you about fighting for something real. Not the cost, which was obvious, but the construction. What gets built in the fighting, not just the legal agreements and the geological surveys and the business plans, the other things. The knowledge of what you're made of. The understanding of who stands with you when standing with you is difficult. The particular, irreplaceable confidence of a person who has made a decision and kept it. She was not the same woman who'd climbed this mountain in October. She was not going to be that woman again. She pulled her coat around her in the summer wind, which was cooler up here than people expected, always, and looked at the mountain above the bore site and thought, Daniel, you were right. You were right about all of it. Then she turned back toward her office, because there was work to do, and the work was hers.
What does that mean, Dan? You've said that several times now. That's his friend code. Look it up. No. Doga kotuwaru.
Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto.
No. Tempest Demo 1.
Chandler doesn't even have a profile picture.
What a fucking bot.
Oh, I know his last name now.
What is it?
It's in his Steam name.
Oh. Hello?
Hello.
That's your cat?
Yes.
Let's go, gang! Oh. Alelele, alelas.
Oh fuck!
I think he's dead. Is he dead? I think he definitely died from that. Yeah, he 100% died from that. Yeah, he's dead. What a fucking idiot, man. He didn't even give himself a chance. He didn't even give life a try, bro. What a fucking chud.
It's kind of cute how you hold him in your arms.
Sit in the ship, chud.
You and Ben were meant together.
True. Ben is dog shit this game, bro, I swear. What a noob. Yeah, noob down, bro. Here, you take the fire exit, and I'll take the front exit, so I don't have to listen to your cat meowing.
You don't like him?
I don't have to answer that question. Okay, Ben's a freaking pussy, and I'm the goat, so. Ain't shit in this fucking building. Where the hell the loot at? It's like supposed to be the apparatus room, but there's no apparatus. God damn it. Go check this room. Dude, where the fuck is the Munyon? I'm pissed.